The Latin American boom is a catchy name for a period of time between the 1950s and the 1970s, during which Latin American literature became worldwide renowned and acclaimed. I think I should talk about the background first. After World War II, Europe was devastated. They were pessimistic about everything, and they turned their eyes to Latin America, one of the few places that got unaffected by Second World War. In the 50s, there was a lot of violence in Latin America. There were a lot of dictatorships throughout the continent. There was Perón in Argentina, there was Pinochet in Chile, Manuel Odría in Peru, Rojas Pinilla in Colombia, and many others. During that period of time, there were some writers that were uncomfortable with the situation in their country, so they started writing against it and acting as political figures against their political systems. It was a time when writers were not there just to write some words and some short stories or novels. It was a time where they had to critique their society. They had to fight injustice and poverty and violence and a lot of things that were happening in that time. There are four writers who were the more influential during the Latin American boom. The first one is Carlos Fuentes. I don't own any physical books of him, though I've read his short stories. I think he was the most unaffected one because the situation in Mexico wasn't as bad as in South America. His more important works are the novel Where the Air is Clear and Aura, which is a short novel. The second writer is Julio Cortázar. Cortázar was an Argentinian. He fought against Perón's regime and he got exiled because of that. He went to live to Paris and he got through some hard times economically because he didn't have much to do at the beginning of the exile. He was the first writer to leave his country because of the political situation. He left in 1951 and went to live in Paris. So I think he's the most important one, or at least the one who began everything. He's best known for his short stories. He's a master of short stories. He's my favorite writer, and I've read pretty much all of his short stories, and most of them are just great masterpieces. And he's also known by his novel Hopscotch, or Rayuela in Spanish. And the two writers left are two Nobel Prize winners. Latin American boom was something big. One is Mario Vargas Llosa. I have two books of him. He's a Peruvian who left his country for the political situation, though he wasn't strictly exiled. He went to Spain to study, but when his visa expired, he moved to Paris to write as a serious thing in the 60s. His best works are The Time of the Hero, which I don't own, and isn't an accurate translation. The exact translation will be something like The City and the Dogs. And the other one is The Greenhouse, which I don't own either. Sorry, but I'm gonna get them and I'm gonna read them and I'm gonna review them as soon as I can. And last but not least is Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Pretty much everybody knows him. He is a Colombian who fought against Gustavo Rojas Pinilla regime and all the regimes that came after that one, because he was a pretty politically involved person. He was exiled because he was a journalist, and on a journal called El Espectador, which still exists, he published an article which was divided in 14 parts, I believe, named The Story of a Shipwrecked Sailor. In this article, Gabriel Garcia Marquez told the story of a Colombian Navy vessel's shipwreck, which was caused by contraband. They had contraband in the boats and they were army boats. So that aroused a lot of controversy, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez was afraid he was going to get killed, so El Espectador sent him to Paris. But in that time, the government closed El Espectador, so Gabriel Garcia Marquez stayed on Paris with no money at all. His best known works and more important ones are, of course, 100 Years of Solitude, The Autumn of the Patriarch, and Chronicle of a Death Foretold. He is actually the best seller of all the Latin American boom writers. He became a millionaire by writing and sold around 50 million copies of 100 Years of Solitude. That's a big number for books. The main Latin American boom characteristics are, first, they're all modernist writings. They all deal with deep and profound society situations. They treat time non-linear. They have a lot of time playing, let's say. They developed an own style from Latin America. That was something new because before them, Latin American writers were always trying to copy European. So they injected life to Latin America. They started using Latin American settings, which was unusual. And their novels and short stories were happening in Mexico and in Colombia, in Argentina, in Peru. They weren't set in Europe, though they lived in Europe. Third, of course, they were political. They talk about politics a lot in their writing, one way or another, either explicit or not, but they were always involved in that. I mean, they were the avant-garde during that period of time, or however that is pronounced. They didn't tell everything to the readers. They kept things to themselves. They just gave hints and stuff. So the reading process was something complex. Some say the first major work from the Latin American boom was The Time of the Hero by Mario Vargas Llosa, but some say that the main work, the first one, was Hopscotch by Julio Cortázar. And since I don't own The Time of the Hero, let's say Hopscotch was the first one. There isn't a precise date when Latin American boom was born, but it was around the late 50s and first years of the 60s. It is said that the cornerstone of the movement was the Cuban Revolution, led by Fidel Castro, which was a left-wing movement that tried to gain the power of Cuba, and actually gained it. All the writers from the Latin American boom, which were more than just the four I mentioned, but these are the more important, so I won't be talking about the others, or maybe, but in other videos. These four writers became fascinated by the left-wing movement led by Fidel Castro. So I think that's when they became more politically involved and they started winning recognition, because the more important thing that was happening in Latin America in that time was the Cuban Revolution. And of course they supported it. I think that's it for the video. Before I leave, I'll tell you a story. One teacher told it to me. These four guys, while living in Paris, were really poor. At the beginning, of course. But really, really poor. The legend, let's call it that way, says that the four of them bought cow bones and pig bones and made soup with that. I mean, the first day Julio Cortázar had it and he did his soup, and then the next day he gave it to Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Then he passed it to Mario Vargas Llosa, and Mario Vargas Llosa to Carlos Fuentes. But don't believe me, that can be a lie. So that's it. Go give birth to yourselves by reading.